Arirang Prime.
Having passed a century stained by war, Korea, China, and Japan now stand at the center of the global economy.
한국, 중국, 일본 모두가 이제 영토 무장을 다 안고 있습니다.
由于过去历史上，由于战争或者是殖民统治，所以呢，使得三国之间的这种历史积怨呢，还是比较深的。
日本と韓国、日本と中国の相対的な協力関係の方がはるかに重要だということを国民が分かっていく必要があるんじゃないでしょうか。
Yet the recurring historical conflicts are an obstacle in their relationship. The year 2013 marks a turning point for the three nations to overcome their century of distrust and prepare for the next century of hope.
Mega Change is a book of future predictions produced by the English weekly magazine, The Economist. It collects together the opinions of experts in different fields such as population, business, medicine, the environment, etc. These experts present their opinions on each of these fields, identifying critical mega changes. The book includes predictions as to who will be wealthier, healthier, and more vibrant in 40 years. The book predicts that Asia will be the center of the global economy, and it foresees Korea surpassing the United States as a wealthy country as it develops. Professor Paul Kennedy of Yale University's Department of History, best known as the author of The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, he points out that the European Union and the United States are both declining in terms of economic and military power. He argues that the global order is already being transformed by the nations of Asia as they realign with China as the primary power at the center. Although many scholars have predicted a future age led by Northeast Asia, there are also scholars such as Guy Sorman in France who suggest it is still too early to speak of an Asian century. In 2013, there remain conflicting opinions about the potential of Korea, China, and Japan. How will these three nations have to prepare in order to open up a Northeast Asian age?
July 2013. A special forum kicked off at a university in Seoul. Attended by scholars from 25 countries, as well as activists from history civil groups, the forum searched for solutions to the historical issues that are hindering the future of Korea, China, and Japan.
In the conference, where civil society leaders gather together with the will to solve historical conflict and build a peace community in East Asia.
The world's only international NGO conference on history was proposed by Korea. It was the civil society's attempt to uncover historical truths and kickstart the conversation necessary for reconciliation.
市民が和解するためには会って話をしないと和解は始まらないので、その意味では非常に大事な会議になっていると思います。
历史问题上，咱们这些专家学者有一个比较一致的认识，
去影响各自国家的政府，为东北亚的和谐、和平发展共同努力。
Celebrating its 5th anniversary this year, the conference was composed of some 40 different programs. From teenagers to teachers and experts, the participants discussed various historical issues and shared their views.
And we should live in peace. Peace is important. Conflict causes a lot of problems, a lot of suffering, especially for women and children. So that if we can find a way to prevent conflict before it even begins, then we should not waste resources in trying to reconcile.
교류와 협력을 확대한다든지 이런 걸 통해 가지고 갈등과 오해를 피하면서 동북아시아라는 하나의 공동체를 같이 만들어내는데 앞장섰으면 좋겠습니다.
The historical chasm between Korea, China, and Japan is deepening. Are there any solutions? To hold a more in-depth discussion, we invited some of the scholars who had attended the International NGO Conference on History and Peace.
What are your feelings in terms of moving forward towards a Northeast Asian community? What do we need to do to prepare? What are really the first steps in that direction?
In East Asia, still this colonial legacy has not been solved yet. So it's really unresolved problems. So we thought we need to find out the way toward the historical reconciliations, understanding each other, and then find out the historical truths so that we could build a good peaceful community based on these historical reconciliations.
And people who actually understood the past now know that without rectifying the past, there's no reconciliation. And that is understood by, I don't say that it's understood by the majority of the people, but the people who reject that idea are minority.
How do you understand me well? Of course I understand that the grassroots movement, where also people started to look into the past, not the politicians, but it was the younger people asking questions about that past. And from there was a greater movement, certainly starting in Germany, to reconsider history education in the country and to look into other patterns than the general way to look at wars, to look at the leadership, to look at the men, and to go for issues like gender and human rights and all these very important environment.
So it's very disturbing for us that at this moment that East Asia, Northeast Asia is playing a more and more important role in the world, in cultural exchanges, in technology, and in the economy, that at the very same time we find all these terrible disputes over territory, in fact, often getting worse.
I think in recent years we've seen an upsurge of nationalist fervor. I think in all three countries, which is based on negative feelings, on adverse feelings of hatred, fear, xenophobia. Then they give an image of the enemy.
Every year on August 15th, the world's attention turns to the Yasukuni Shrine in Japan. This is because of the recurring worship at the shrine, which honors 14 Class A war criminals. Despite the world's concerns that these visits are glorifying wars of aggression, Japan's right-wing politicians have continued the tradition.
ただいまですね、 個人の立場で私的な参拝を行ってまいりました。総理とお話はしておりません。自分の判断で行いました。
戦没者をどういう形で慰霊するかは純粋に国内問題であります。よその国から批判とか干渉を受けるものではない。
Japan asserts that it's only natural to commemorate those who sacrificed their lives for their country. This, however, is a highly controversial issue.
永久戦犯が祀られているっていうのは、一つの象徴的なことであって、したがってその靖国神社に日本の政治指導者がね参拝するということは、日本はかつての戦争について反省してないと。でむしろその戦争の遂行した植民地支配を遂行した責任者をね、今の政治指導者は賛美していると、こういうふうに受け取られても仕方がないですよね。
Despite domestic and international oppositions, Japanese Prime Minister Abe has stated that he will let his cabinet members make their own decisions. At the memorial ceremony for the war dead from World War II, unlike his predecessors, Prime Minister Abe chose not to mention Japan's wrongdoing and its repentance.
尊い命を捧げられたあなた方の犠牲の上に、今私たちが享受する平和と繁栄があります。そのことを片時たりとも忘れません。
And he continued his remark that glorified Japan's invasions of its neighboring countries. Prime Minister Abe continues to deny the past and ignore the response of the international community. And this conservative shift in Japan is alarming its neighbors. A launching ceremony was held recently for the Izumo, the largest aircraft carrier in the history of Japan's maritime self-defense force. The nearby nations, including the US, have expressed their concern over Japan's military reinforcement. However, the most offended party was China, for the carrier was named after the warship used by Japan during the 1937 Sino-Japanese War. Japan's conservative swing is fueling territorial disputes.
平穏かつ安定的な維持管理を図ることを目的として今回、これは所有者がお降りになりたいという意向もあり、保有することになる。
Japan announced its plans to nationalize the Senkaku Islands, or Ieodo Islands in Chinese. China protested immediately, and anti-Japanese rallies swept across its land. As time passed, these protests grew in size and frequency. The anti-Japanese sentiment had reached its peak. Some demonstrators destroyed cars and attacked Japanese stores. The cause célèbre between China and Japan, called the Ieodo Islands, or Senkaku Islands in Japanese, is a group of islands in the East China Sea that sits 330 kilometers from China's mainland and 410 kilometers from Okinawa, Japan. The territorial disputes between China and Japan were triggered by two wars that shook Northeast Asia a century ago. As the victor of the First Sino-Japanese War, Japan assumed control of Taiwan and the Senkaku Islands. However, when Japan was defeated in World War II, the jurisdiction over Okinawa, to which the islands belonged, was handed over to the US. The disputes over the islands surfaced in 1972, when the US returned Okinawa to Japan. China is claiming that the islands are its territory. Japan argues that it merely recovered its territory from the US.
日本政府は1895年に、尖閣諸島は誰のものにも属してない、だからこれを日本領土とした。これは国際法的に言うと宣戦の法理、先に見つけたものが 誰のものにも属してないものを先に見つけたものが自分のものと正式に表明すれば、それは国際法的に認められるんだと、こういうような論理ですね。
Day after day, the Chinese media reported on the largest anti-Japanese rallies since the establishment of the two nations' diplomatic ties and criticized Japan's nationalization plans. The territorial disputes had become an unyielding battle to save face. The Japanese media retaliated.
爆发点是属于钓鱼岛的国有化，但是实际上中日两国之间的心里边，特别是民众心里边，实际上存在着一种由于历史和现实造成的这种积怨。
一般の市民はですね、尖閣は日本固有の領土であって何ら問題もないというものを9割程度支持していると思います。
The size of the Senkaku Islands, or Ieodo Islands, is only 6.3 square kilometers. Every now and then an incident takes place in the waters nearby, when those heading to the islands are stopped by Japan's patrol boat. Although the islands are under Japan's effective control, any access is banned. However, when the territorial disputes surfaced, more and more people attempted to enter the islands. A Japanese far-right group has already made 4 attempts this year to visit the Senkaku Islands. The tense tug of war over the island's ownership continues. Together with activists from Hong Kong and Taiwan, China is also trying incessantly to land on the Ieodo Islands.
遇到日本那个军舰的拦截，然后我们就挂出了我们的横幅，还打出了我们中国的国旗，向日本表示抗议。在中国的领海，而日本人却是那么嚣张，所以给我感到非常气愤。
Lee has been a guardian of the islands for 14 long years. Landing on the islands was never easy. At times, his attempt was crushed by Japan's fleet, and once he was even arrested by the Japanese police.
所以在钓鱼岛问题上，我们中国政府有一个态度，说这个问题要留给下一代解决，是好像是在这么说。为什么要留给下一代解决？那是一种逃避。 我认为，在我们这一代就把钓鱼岛问题彻底解决。
The war over the islands shows no signs of abating, for the territorial disputes have begun hampering their economic ties. Boycott of Japanese products raged across China. The Japanese automobile industry was the hardest hit. In October 2012, the production of Japanese cars plummeted by more than 50% year over year. However, China's economy also suffered when a number of Japanese companies retrieved their investments and left China in response to the violent anti-Japanese rallies. Underlying the territorial disputes between China and Japan are huge economic interests. The EEZ is a sea zone that stretches out to 200 nautical miles, or approximately 370 kilometers from the coast. Within this area, a nation has exclusive rights over all resources as well as their development. The designation of the EEZ means that the ocean is now a critical part of a country's territory and economy. According to the EEZ claim by Japan, the controversial Senkaku Islands are part of its territory. In fact, according to its claim, the marine zone under its jurisdiction is 10 times bigger than its land area.
200km 수역을 차지하는 것은 대단히 큰 자원수역을 확보하는 문제이기 때문에 결국 도서 분쟁하고 이 자원수역 확보 문제는 뭐 밀접한 관계가 있다. 따라서 결국은 제가 보기에는 해양수역, 즉 특정 도서를 중심으로 해양수역의 확보, 결국 해양수역이라는 것은 자원수역의 확보가 아니겠어요. 그래서 아마 자원쟁탈전의 어떤 그 일부로서 아마 이 문제가 계속 부각되는 것이 아닌가 이렇게 생각이 됩니다.
The economic value of the ocean is limitless. The East China Sea, which lies between Korea, China, and Japan, is called Asia's Persian Gulf due to its abundant underground resources. These rich resources are economic incentives that the three nations cannot yield to each other. Due to the intensifying disputes, the ocean has grabbed the attention of the public in Korea, China, and Japan. To Korean people, Ieodo is an island of imagination. And headed to this mysterious island are middle and high school teachers from Korea.
네, 섬에 대한 정보도 너무 없고 그래서 이런 기회를 찾았는데 이어도 가는 기회가 된 거예요.
A special lecture is given on board. The participants get to see the real side of this unfamiliar island. A total of 31 teachers got a chance to visit Ieodo as part of their training program. What they learn here will be passed down to their students.
많은 교사들이 우리의 그 넓은 해양 영토에 그 미래의 그 영토가 있다는 걸 이해하게 되고 그걸 통해서 또 교실에 들어와서는 우리 자라나는 미래의 꿈소년 청소년들이 한국엔 또 다른 영토인 바다 영토가 있다는 걸 이해하게 된다면 이런 연수는 대단히 성공적으로 끝날 거라고 저는 확신합니다.
The Ara, headed toward the island, sails onwards. Eight hours after their departure from Jeju Port, they spot the Ieodo Rock Ocean Research Station. The research station was built in 2003 for maritime investigation and research activities. And next to the station is the submerged rock of Ieodo, consisting of 4 peaks located 4.6 meters underwater.
밤새 흔들리다가 밖에 나오니까 시원하고 좋은데 이렇게 고생하면서 이 기지를 건설했구나라고 생각하니까 감회가 좀 새롭습니다.
감개무량합니다. 너무 의젓하고 외롭기도 하고 저렇게 지키고 있다는 게.
Although referred to as an island, Ieodo is in fact a rock, making it an ownerless territory under the international law. The problem lies in the fact that the EEZs claimed by Korea and China overlap with each other.
국가 간의 어떤 그 대상 수역의 폭이 400캐리가 안 되는 경우에는 불가피하게 이제 해양 경계 협정을 할 수밖에 없습니다. 그러나 이제 이것은 이제 자국의 해양 수역의 확보를 하는 문제이기 때문에 상당히 그 합의가 대단히 어렵지요.
How can these exacerbating territorial disputes be resolved? Experts suggest taking a standpoint that transcends national borders, but it's easier said than done.
You have to go to history. In what context this part of land began to be considered part of this country or that country? And if the context is a context of colonization, conquest, etc., then that should be the basis of judgment.
Well, for us, I think we're proposing the idea of the common would be very crucial. And so I think instead of the very capitalist mindset to privatize and colonize, then I think redefining certain natural, so-called natural resources as common and to be for common use.
That has been the case in Europe also. They have developed first that economic cooperation and then EU, the economic common market, and then economic community, and then they have developed European Union out of that.
And then there was a very practical point between the two eternal enemies, France and Germany, where there was an enormous shortage of resources. And only if they were able to open their minds again and use each other's opportunities, then the rebuilding of Europe could take place.
After World War II, France proposed that the production and supply of coal and steel which are important war resources, be jointly managed. While promoting economic cooperation, this suggestion also aimed to achieve its secondary goal of preventing wars. And hence, the European coal and steel community was born, which in turn sowed the seeds for today's EU.
I think fundamentally the position after the Second World War was that the leaders in France and Germany in particular were determined that after having fought 3 wars in less than 100 years, they were determined never to repeat that experience because it had been so appalling, the costs had been so appalling for both countries.
Europe had built its community on economic cooperation, an initiative that was made possible by Germany's sincere efforts to attain reconciliation. After losing the war, Germany promptly made an apology and began compensating the victims by signing an agreement with 12 victim countries in Western Europe, including Israel. Its apology continues to this day. In August, German Chancellor Angela Merkel paid an official visit to the Dachau concentration camp memorial site.
Die Erinnerung an diese Schicksale erfüllt mich mit tiefer Trauer und mit Scham. Zugleich geht von Orten wie der KZ-Gedenkstätte Dachau eine eindringliche Mahnung aus.
Having regained the trust of its neighbors through its sincere apologies, Germany emerged as a leader in the EU. It was cooperation, not conflict, that the EU nations chose. Korea, China, and Japan have much to learn from their efforts.
日中間とも自由貿易協定ずっと交渉してるわけです。もういろんな国と十何年もで交渉してきてますから、まあなぜか一番近いところだけが一番遅れているので、まああと貿易量も実際大きいですから、本当にそれぞれの経済構造にとってやっぱり大きな意味を持つのは近いところとの関係なんですね。
East Asia is the only economic bloc in the world that has not achieved integration, such as the FTA. Talks over the economic integration of the 3 countries are currently underway. The creation of multilateral economic blocs is a global trend, as can be seen by the EU and NAFTA. One example of economic integration aimed at dominating the markets of Korea, China, and Japan is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Meanwhile, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is a multilateral FTA for East Asia centered on China. Talks are underway between Korea, China, and Japan, and the 10 ASEAN members. In short, the 3 nations are juggling the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and their own tripartite FTA to achieve economic integration. Having experienced the 1997 Asian financial crisis, Korea, China, and Japan agree on the need for economic partnership. However, the path toward economic integration is dotted with obstacles. After all, it took 14 long years to begin their negotiations on the tripartite FTA, which was first brought up in 1999.
한중일 FTA 딜레마는 그 경제적인 측면으로 봐서는 분명히 FTA를 하는 것이 타당하고 또 이렇게 굳이 길게 끌 이유가 없지만 정치적인 갈등 관계가 워낙 첨예하게 대립되다 보니까 자꾸만 늦어지는 그런 모양새입니다.
最关键的现在一个因素就是中日之间，包括韩日之间的历史跟领土、领海的争端，这是可能困扰中日韩自贸区谈判的一个最大障碍。
August 14th, a gathering was convened in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul. In one voice, the people demanded Japan's apology for its practice of sexual slavery during wartime. It was the International Memorial Day for Comfort Women.
지난해 12월 10일에 아시아 여성들이 함께 모여서 8월 14일은 굉장히 역사적으로 의미 있는 날이다. 앞으로 이 날을 세계 일본군 위안부 메모리얼 데이.
The issue of Japan's comfort women's system first surfaced 22 years ago with the testimony of a victim. But to this day, the Japanese government remains silent.
일본 대사는 들어라. 내가 전 세계로 다니면서 동상을 씌울 테니 사죄와 배상하라.
日本政府は慰安婦制度の地域を認めよう。日本政府は
On the same day, a similar rally took place in Tokyo. The Japanese people who took to the streets demanded that the government admit its crime and apologize.
国際社会が一日も早い解決を日本政府に求めているんだということを訴えるためにもこういう記念日にしたりあるいは国連記念日にしていくということは有効な方法だと。
The victims of Japan's military sexual slavery are passing away one by one. To remember them, the protesters marched down the streets holding lamps that bore their names. And since it's a part of history that should never be repeated, they also called for the UN's designation of August 14th as an official Memorial Day. They were called comfort women, or Japanese military sex slaves. During World War II, the Japanese military sent women from the colonies to the front lines of battlefields and forced them to serve as sex slaves to boost the soldiers' morale. However, Japan has neither shown repentance nor apologized. Instead, the politicians are merely repeating their ludicrous remark that no sexual slavery was committed by Japan's military.
銃弾がね雨嵐のごとく飛び交う中で命かけてそこを走っていく時にねまあ休息じゃないけれどもそういうことをさせてあげようと思ったら慰安婦制度っていうのが必要なのはこれは誰だと分かるわけです。
Unlike the Japanese government, there is an introspective voice in Japan that is calling for a correct apprehension of history. This is the only museum in Japan that deals with Japanese military sexual slavery. There were 155 victims from 10 countries, including Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines. However, only a fraction of the victims have agreed to being exposed through the exhibition.
これ日本が侵攻したラインの一番広い部分を取っているんですけれども、ほとんどすべての地域に慰安所が作られたことがわかると思います。
The Japanese military built more than 400 comfort stations across Asia, which means that it's likely that there are many more victims below the surface. However, the issue of Japan's sexual slavery remained hushed for long even after the war. In 2000, the victims convened the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal on Japan's military sexual slavery. The first of its kind, this People's Tribunal decided in favor of the victims, and even the Emperor of Japan was found guilty. However, Japan has ignored the verdict on the grounds that it was given by a People's Tribunal. This is history that's not taught at schools. In fact, the question most frequently asked by the Japanese visitors is whether all the exhibits are actually true. The shock they experience when they learn about the sexual slavery issue is quite apparent in the visitor's book.
ミュージアムでさまざまな慰安婦たちの声が残されているのを見て、やっぱり心身ともに傷ついたそういう慰安婦たちの声にもっと耳を傾けるべきだなと思って。
The Women's Active Museum on War and Peace was founded in 2005. Countless people who have visited it know the truth of the past.
とりわけ今の時点でまだ日本政府が謝罪も補償もある意味でちゃんとした解決をしていない中で、その解決していない政府に本当にできうる限りに被害者が一人でも多く生きている間にその責任を果たさせて、事実を伝えていくという作業をこれからも続けていきたいと思っています。
Can Korea and Japan ever reach historical reconciliation? On August 12th, Professor Sok-Hyung Duk ran an advertisement on the Wall Street Journal's website with his own money. It compares the Chancellor of Germany, who strives to reach full historical reconciliation, with the Japanese politicians who are denying the past.
가장 중요한 차이점은 독일은 진심으로 사죄하고 보상을 한다는 거죠. 하지만 일본에서는 반성은커녕 사죄조차도 안 하고 있는 그런 상황을 한번 비교 광고를 통해서 세계인들한테 쉽게 알려주고 싶었다라는 거죠.
Just as its slogan, Making Peace with History implies, true peace between Korea, China, and Japan is only possible within the framework of history. As Europe's success story shows, economic cooperation and historical reconciliation are inseparable. Experts emphasize that such efforts need to be gradual and should be made first in the private sector and in areas where consensus can be formed.
So basically for Europe, the beginning of the project was totally on practical, economical necessity. But of course, that could only happen because there were some people who were able to step over the normal reaction of revenge and anger and whatever, and those who won and those who lost, you know, and to say, okay, we go a bit further. So I think that is really important to realize. Reconciliation didn't take place at all. The first steps for reconciliation and really being able to talk about the past were only in the course of the 60s.
At the level of the people, civil society, if you like, to create a certain pressure, not just government level, not just state level, but people's level, in order to sort of change this kind of relationship is very crucial.
So for us then, it's very important to forge interactions among the people's movements of these three countries so that we can see the kind of problems we are faced with. So there are a lot of problems that are very urgent. For example, problems of the climate change, problems of the Fukushima nuclear accident. And so on these issues, we feel that there is a lot that we can be working together on so that we can forge a future of hope and not a future of hatred.
Northeast Asia, the biggest security issue in many respects is environmental. These issues call out for some sort of cooperation between the countries to address the really serious security issues of this age.
So more and more we will have the problems of these environmental disasters. So I think that's enormous jobs to do in this regard. So this movement can be a good ground, I think, on which we can cooperate each other to build our East Asian community.
When it comes to environmental issues, the three close neighbors are bound by the same fate. Unrestrained by national borders, environmental problems cannot be single-handedly solved by one country. And thus the need for nation-level cooperation. Since 1999, Korea, China, and Japan have been holding the annual tripartite environmental ministers meeting. Unlike other joint initiatives that were severed by historical disputes, this meeting has never been canceled. It's the only ministerial meeting in Northeast Asia.
(2011년도에는) 3월달 일본이 상당히 지진과 쓰나미로 인해서 어려움이 있었음에도 불구하고 그 해에도 한중일 환경장관 회의를 개최했습니다. 이렇듯이 그 한중일 3국이 환경 공동체의 의식을 가지고 꾸준하게 그 한중일 환경 협력을 한다면 동북아 지역의 그 관계 형성에 긍정적인 영향을 미칠 것으로 생각이 됩니다.
The Kabuchi Desert, located in Inner Mongolia in China, is the source of 40% of the yellow dust headed to Korea. The yellow dust phenomenon that occurs each year is not a natural disaster. It is a man-made disaster caused by reckless grazing added to climate change. But now, trees are taking root in the once bleak Kabuchi Desert. A Korean NGO's hard efforts have transformed the desert, something that no one thought would be possible. The planting that began in 2006 has flourished into 6 million trees, spreading green across the desert. The UN Convention to Combat Desertification has praised this as a successful measure against desertification. This outcome was possible thanks to the close collaboration between Korea and China.
만약에 이 금년이 안 된다면 내년부터는 참가하겠다는 것이 지금 거의 다 컨센서스가 이루어지고 있고 저는 내년에 이 한중일 대학생 녹색봉사단이 내몽고 구부지 사막에서 함께 땀 흘리고 나무를 심는 것 이것이 되리라고 기대하고 또 그렇게 노력을 하겠습니다.
This is a biotechnology research institute in Daejeon, Korea. Professor Emmanuel Pestreich met with Dr. Kwak Sang-soo, whose work is aimed at preventing desertification. Dr. Kwak realized that there was a solution to environmental problems, as well as food shortages and energy crises: sweet potatoes.
중국 농업과학원 고구마 연구소에 고구마 자원들을 우리가
네.
설득해서 심게 했습니다. 처음으로.
네.
심어보니까 잘 자라더라 이거죠.
네.
잘 자란 품종에다가 우리가 개발한 고위의 그 부하가치를 높인다든지 어떤 스트레스에 잘 견디는 윈자를 현재 중국 연구자하고 같이 협력해서 좀 도입하고 있습니다. 한중 합작으로 보면 되죠.
네.
Although still in its infancy, the joint research by Korea and China is bearing fruit. Dr. Kwak emphasizes that environmental issues require the efforts of both the government and the people.
중국의 연구소도 일본의 이런 연구를 하는 일본의 도토리 대학 건조지 연구센터가 있습니다. 그러니까 어떤 연구소가 대학 간에 개인 간의 협력이 이루어지지만 국가 차원에서 한중 사막화 방지 공동 연구처럼 한중일 사막화 방지 생명과 공동 연구센터로 발전된다면은 굉장히 신의 효과가 있다고 생각됩니다.
The active discussion on the Korea-China-Japan community led to the birth of the Trilateral Cooperation Secretariat in 2011 in Seoul. The Trilateral Cooperation Secretariat currently conducts a variety of programs to ensure smooth communication between the three countries. A case in point is its Young Ambassador program.
I guess by doing this kind of basic level of exchange and trying kind of, how can I say, the effort to understand each other, then this is going to actually benefit the future kind of, how can I say, the perspective of this region.
As the first international organization to be jointly launched by the three nations, the Trilateral Cooperation Secretariat serves as a hub for cooperation. It's promoting the spirit of collaboration and integration in Northeast Asia through initiatives such as the annual Trilateral Summit and the International Forum for the Leaders of the three countries.
Every step we take, we make more progress. And as far as I understand, EU took almost 60 years in achieving this level of integration and cooperation. I think in the future, our three countries also can make a higher degree of integration in the future. Even though it may not be easy to arrive such a high level of integration like European Union.
For a long time, Korea, China, and Japan have inspired one another to attain brilliant progress. Despite the permanent scars left by wars and invasions, there is still hope for the three nations. After all, they've revived their deep-rooted cultural exchanges and have come together to ponder over the historical issues and map a path forward. Today, Korea, China, and Japan are rewriting a history that will unlock the future.
Oddly, although they are geographically the closest nations, China, Korea, and Japan sometimes seem like the most far apart in a psychological sense. But the peoples of these three nations cannot survive if they turn away from each other. The wisdom of finding a way to live together is not just a matter for the individual or for the family. Nations must live together peacefully for mutual prosperity. As an American scholar with a deep concern for Northeast Asia and many close friends in all three countries, let me close with a few words from the famed management guru Peter Drucker. Don't solve problems, find opportunities. Drucker meant by that rather than becoming obsessed with solving every problem that we face, we should find new directions and new visions. This is an idea that Korea, China, and Japan also need to consider carefully. The tangled problems of history, territories, and politics that divide the three nations can be resolved if they pursue new opportunities and new horizons based on a common understanding of history.